Millionaire businessman pretends to be poor to test employees. But what he discovers makes him rethink his life. John Harris stood in his penthouse office, the skyline of Manhattan stretching out before him. A vision of success in his sharp, tailored suit. John was a man who had achieved the American dream. From humble beginnings, he had built Harris Enterprises into a multinational conglomerate, a symbol of his hard work and sharp business acumen. But as he gazed out at the bustling city below, his mind was restless. Just hours earlier, John had attended a leadership seminar. The speaker, a respected author and CEO, had shared a story about walking in the shoes of the everyman to better understand the pulse of his organization. This wasn't the typical corporate jargon. It resonated deeply with John. Over the years, he had prided himself on cultivating a progressive, people-first company culture. But nagging doubts had crept into his mind. Could he truly understand what it was like for the employees at the very bottom of the ladder? Empathy breeds real leadership, the speaker had said, his words echoing in John's thoughts. That evening, John sat at the head of the dinner table in his minimalist, modern apartment. His wife Eleanor looked at him curiously as he toyed with his fork, pushing roasted asparagus around his plate. "You're unusually quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" she asked, her tone warm and concerned. John leaned back, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Eleanor, do you ever wonder what people really think of me at the company? Not the board members or department heads, but the janitors, the receptionists, the interns." She raised an eyebrow. "Well, I think most of them would say you're a good boss. You've always been approachable, haven't you?" "Maybe," John said, "but approachable isn't enough. I want to know if we're truly living up to the values I've built this company on. It's easy to assume things from where I sit, but the truth might be very different." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "You're cooking up an idea, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes." He chuckled softly. "You know me too well. I want to go undercover in the company, Eleanor. As a janitor. See things for myself, the way the lowest paid workers live it." Her smile faded. "John, that's ambitious. But do you really think that's the best way? What if you're recognized?" "That's part of the challenge," he replied. "I'll work with a professional to create a foolproof disguise. If I want to see the truth, I have to do this." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for doubt but finding none. "All right," she said finally. "But promise me you'll be careful. You're stepping into a world you haven't seen in a long time. It might not be what you expect." The next morning, John was back at his office, his decision resolute. He summoned Emily Parsons, his trusted chief of staff. Emily was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and a loyalty to match. When he explained his plan, her reaction was predictably skeptical. "You want to pose as a janitor?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Do you even know how to use a mop?" John laughed. "I'll figure it out. Emily, this is about understanding the real culture of Harris Enterprises. If people know I'm the CEO, they'll act differently around me." Emily tapped her pen against her notebook, considering his words. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," he replied. "I need your help to make it happen." By the end of the day, Emily had connected him with a top-tier transformation consultant. Over the next week, John worked closely with the consultant, testing different disguises until they settled on the perfect one. A scruffy man named Joe, complete with thick-rimmed glasses, a shaggy brown wig, and a janitor's uniform that seemed to hang off his frame. Standing in front of a mirror in the consultant's studio, John hardly recognized himself. Gone was the polished CEO. In his place stood a man who looked like he'd spent a lifetime cleaning floors. "Joe it is," he said with a wry smile. On Monday morning, Joe reported for duty at Harris Enterprises headquarters. Armed with a mop, a bucket, and a new perspective, John stepped into the world of his employees, ready to uncover the truth about the culture he had built, or failed to build. The first step into John Harris's undercover journey as Joe was orchestrated with precision. Emily, skeptical yet fiercely loyal, had taken charge of ensuring the operation remained airtight. It was Monday morning, and the executive wing of Harris Enterprises bustled as usual. But today was different. John was not stepping off the elevator in a tailored suit, but slipping in through the service entrance in a second-hand van. Inside the vehicle, he adjusted his disguise one last time. His glasses pinched his nose, and the wig felt itchy under the cap of his janitor's uniform. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror and grinned. He was unrecognizable. It was both thrilling and unnerving. "All right, Joe," he muttered to himself, "time to meet the team." Emily had worked magic to arrange for Joe to be hired as a temporary janitor through a third-party agency, ensuring no one within the company would connect the dots. His background paperwork was fabricated, and he was listed as a 45-year-old drifter with experience in odd jobs, but no fixed residence. The details were just sparse enough to discourage deep inquiries, but solid enough to withstand scrutiny. John pushed open the service door and walked into the operations wing, where the janitorial staff congregated before their shifts. The smell of cleaning chemicals and old coffee filled the air. "Hey, new guy," called a stout, middle-aged man with a wiry mustache and a clipboard in hand. "You Joe?" "That's me," John replied, adjusting the strap of his mop bucket. His voice was gravelly, tinged with a forced humility that he hoped came across as authentic. "I'm Ralph," the man said, offering a handshake. His grip was firm, but not overly friendly. "I'm the supervisor around here. You do what I say, and we'll get along just fine." "Got it," John said. "Good," Ralph continued. "You're on the executive floor today. It's quiet up there in the mornings. Just wipe down the desks, empty the trash, and mop the floors. Stick to the routine, and don't go snooping around." "Got it." "Understood," John replied, hiding a smirk. He imagined Ralph's reaction if he knew who he was talking to. Ralph handed him a set of keys and a laminated map of the building. "Lunch is at noon. Don't be late. Oh, and avoid that corner office at the end of the hall. Big boss's space. He doesn't like being interrupted." John almost laughed out loud. Noted. As he made his way to the executive floor, the familiar surroundings took on a new light. The polished marble tiles he had walked on for years now looked like a daunting task to clean. Every smudge and speck seemed glaringly obvious. He passed by his own office door, resisting the urge to linger. Inside, he knew his temporary replacement, a sharp young VP named Garrett, was likely already at work. It was surreal knowing that while the business world would see Garrett at the helm, John would be scrubbing coffee stains a few feet away. John's first task was the large conference room. It was pristine, yet Ralph's checklist demanded it be wiped down daily. He took a rag and began to clean the table, marveling at the little details he'd never noticed. The faint scratches on the wood, the ghostly impressions of coffee rings. As he worked, a young woman entered the room, her heels clicking against the floor. She carried a tablet and a look of quiet determination. "Good morning," she said, her voice polite but distant. "Morning," John replied, keeping his tone neutral. The woman gave him a quick nod before sitting at the far end of the table. She began tapping away at her tablet, engrossed in her work. John continued cleaning, observing her out of the corner of his eye. She was professional but approachable. Someone who didn't carry the air of superiority he often encountered in boardrooms. "That's Lisa," Ralph had told him earlier. "She's one of the interns. Nice enough kid, but don't bother her. She's got her head full of big ideas." After a moment, Lisa glanced up and offered him a faint smile. "Thank you for keeping this place looking so nice." John blinked, caught off guard by her genuine acknowledgement. "Just doing my job," he said. Her smile grew a little. "Well, it's appreciated. My desk's the one by the window. If you ever need water or anything, feel free to ask." John nodded, surprised by her kindness. Most employees he'd passed in the hallway hadn't even made eye contact, much less greeted him. As he left the conference room and moved to the main corridor, the sounds of the office began to fill the space. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and snippets of conversation drifted through the air. "Did you see the email about budget cuts?" one voice said. "Yeah, another round. You know who they'll target, operations staff again," replied another. John's ears perked up. He noted the hushed tones and exchanged glances between the employees. Already, cracks in the company's facade were beginning to show. By lunchtime, John had a list of observations swirling in his mind. The dismissive glances, the whispered complaints, and the lone kind voice of Lisa painted a complex picture of his company's culture. It was nothing like the one he thought he had cultivated from his corner office. As he sat in the staff lounge eating a sandwich, He couldn't shake the feeling that this experiment was going to reveal much more than he'd anticipated. Joe Harris, formerly John Harris, stood outside Harris Enterprises' towering glass facade, gripping the handle of a mop bucket with one hand and the strap of a tattered duffel bag with the other. The crisp morning air bit at his cheeks, and for the first time in years, he felt the unfamiliar sensation of being invisible. People brushed past him, focused on their phones or hurried conversations, sparing him only the occasional glance. Inside, the reception area buzzed with the energy of the workday beginning. Men and women in sharp suits and polished shoes clicked across the marble floors, exchanging pleasantries or furiously typing on their phones. Joe approached the reception desk, where a young man with an immaculate blazer and a practiced smile stood. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, glancing up briefly before returning his gaze to the computer screen. "Yes, I'm Joe, the new janitor," John said, pitching his voice lower and gruffer than usual. The receptionist's polite demeanor vanished instantly. "Ah, right," he said curtly, barely looking at him again. "Maintenance office is down the hall to the left. Look for the sign." "Thanks," Joe muttered, dragging the bucket behind him as he shuffled toward the maintenance office. The receptionist's indifference didn't surprise him, but it stung nonetheless. It was his first taste of how easily the smallest positions were overlooked. The maintenance office was a stark contrast to the polished opulence of the main floors. Its walls were a dull gray, adorned with mismatched bulletin boards and faded safety posters. A grizzled man in his 50s sat behind a cluttered desk, flipping through a clipboard. His name tag read Frank. "You must be Joe," Frank grunted without looking up. "Took you long enough?" "Yes, sir." "First day," Joe replied. He was determined to play the role convincingly. Frank finally looked up, squinting at him through thick glasses. "All right, here's your route for the day." He handed Joe a piece of paper. "Break rooms at noon, but don't get used to it. We work hard here, and I don't tolerate slackers." "Yes, sir," Joe repeated, taking the paper and stuffing it into his pocket. With his mop and bucket, Joe made his way to his assigned area, the 18th floor, home to some of the company's top executives. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent countless hours in the sleek conference rooms on this floor, dictating the future of Harris Enterprises. Now he'd be cleaning the floors he once strode across in expensive loafers. As the day progressed, Joe settled into his routine. He scrubbed smudges off glass doors, mopped spills from the breakroom floor, and discreetly emptied trash bins overflowing with discarded paper and coffee cups. The physical labor wasn't as challenging as he'd expected. John had always prided himself on his fitness, but the mental toll of being treated like a fixture was far heavier than he anticipated. Several employees passed by him without a second glance. Some even stepped over the mop bucket, as if it were an inconvenience. A few barked orders at him, demanding that he clean up coffee spills or restock the restroom supplies. No one asked for his name, but not everyone was indifferent. As Joe worked in the break room, a young woman approached him with a warm smile. "Hi there. You must be new," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Lisa." Joe paused, taken aback. "Oh, hi," he said, shaking her hand with his gloved one. "Yeah, first day. Well, welcome. If you need anything, let me know. I'm just an intern, but I've been around long enough to know where everything is," she said, gesturing toward the snack cabinet. "Want some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." The sincerity in her offer was disarming. Joe nodded. "Thanks. I'd appreciate that." As Lisa poured him a cup, they chatted briefly. She mentioned her plans to work in marketing and how her internship was helping her pay for her mother's medical bills. Her kindness reminded Joe why he was doing this experiment: to find the Lisas of the company and ensure they were recognized and supported. By the end of his shift, Joe had learned a great deal. He'd seen the hierarchy of attitudes in action, from the curt indifference of the receptionist to the toxic condescension of some senior employees. But he'd also glimpsed humanity in people like Lisa, who treated everyone with equal respect. As he packed up for the day, Frank approached him. "Not bad, Joe," he said gruffly. "You keep this up, and you'll fit in fine." "Thanks, Frank," Joe replied, though his mind was already racing. The day had been enlightening, but it was just the beginning. He still had much to uncover about the company he thought he knew so well. The next morning, Joe arrived early, determined to observe the company's rhythm during its busiest hours. The 18th floor was already abuzz with activity. Phones rang incessantly, executives exchanged sharp greetings, and the sound of heels echoed in the glass-walled corridors. Joe pushed his mop bucket into the staff kitchen, mentally preparing for another day of blending into the background. As he worked, the true dynamics of Harris Enterprises began to reveal themselves. The glossy facade of the company's public image masked the cracks in its foundation. Joe overheard snippets of conversations that ranged from dismissive comments about lower-ranking employees to thinly veiled insults. He realized just how invisible the janitorial staff, and by extension he truly were. Near the elevators, a group of middle management employees stood chatting, their voices low but their tones sharp. "You know," one of them said, eyeing a nearby janitor who wasn't Joe, "these guys have it easy. Come in, clean a bit, go home. No pressure. Wish I could trade places." The others chuckled, one of them adding, "Maybe we should restructure it again. Cut the janitorial hours. Who'd even notice?" Joe's grip tightened on the mop handle, but he kept his expression neutral. It was one thing to suspect that such attitudes existed. It was another to hear them openly expressed. By mid-morning, Joe had made his way to one of the executive offices to empty the trash bins. Inside, two senior managers were in a heated discussion. He recognized them instantly. One was Patrick Olson, Vice President of Operations, a man John Harris had trusted for years. Patrick's voice was sharp as he barked orders at a junior employee who stood awkwardly at the door. "Do I need to explain this again?" Patrick snapped, waving a spreadsheet in the air. "If we don't hit our quarterly targets, heads are going to roll. And believe me, it won't be mine." Joe moved quietly, emptying the bins and wiping the desk, but his presence seemed to annoy Patrick. "Do that later," Patrick barked, not even glancing at him. "We're in the middle of something important." "Yes, sir," Joe muttered, moving out of the room. He barely made it a few steps down the hall when the door behind him opened, and the junior employee stepped out, shoulders slumped and face pale. Joe recognized the look, intimidation mixed with a hint of despair. "Hey," Joe called out softly. The young man turned, surprised. "Don't let it get to you. Everyone starts somewhere." The employee hesitated, then nodded, offering a weak smile before walking away. Joe's chest tightened. For years, he had relied on people like Patrick to carry out his vision for the company. Now he wondered how much of his own success had been built on fear rather than inspiration. As the day progressed, Joe found himself crossing paths with Lisa again in the break room. She greeted him with the same warmth as before, a beacon of humanity amidst the cold professionalism of the office. "How's day 2 going?" she asked, leaning against the counter with her coffee mug. "Busy," Joe replied with a small smile. "Seems like this place never slows down." Lisa laughed. "You're telling me? My department is launching a new campaign, and they've been running us ragged. I've seen more of this coffee machine than I have my own apartment." Her easygoing nature was refreshing. "Well," Joe said, "at least you're staying positive." Lisa shrugged. "Gotta find the silver linings, right? I mean, not everyone here is the friendliest. Some people treat me like I'm invisible just because I'm an intern. But I figure if I stay true to myself, the right people will notice." Joe felt a flicker of hope. Lisa was exactly the kind of person he wanted his company to nurture, driven, kind, and resilient. Yet, her words hinted at the uphill battle she faced in a culture that often overlooked those at the bottom. Later that afternoon, Joe's route took him to the cafeteria, where employees gathered for lunch. The atmosphere was more relaxed, but the invisible hierarchies remained evident. Executives huddled in one corner, while interns and junior staff clustered at the far end of the room. Joe worked methodically, clearing tables and wiping counters, listening to fragments of conversation that painted a vivid picture of the workplace. At one table, a group of HR representatives discussed a recent policy change. "I get that we need to cut costs," one of them said, "but freezing raises for the cleaning staff feels a bit harsh." "Harsh or not, it's necessary," another replied. "It's not like they're the backbone of the company." Joe's stomach churned. Was this what his leadership had condoned? Policies that devalued the very people who kept the company running? As the day wound down, Joe returned to the maintenance office to clock out. Frank glanced at him and grunted, "Not bad, kid. You might last here after all." "Thanks, Frank," Joe said, but his mind was elsewhere. The day had left him shaken. He had seen firsthand the apathy, the dismissal, and the small acts of kindness that flickered like fragile lights in a dark room. Walking out of the building, Joe looked up at the shining Harris Enterprises logo. This wasn't just a company, it was a reflection of him. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. By the middle of the week, Joe had become a fixture in the background of Harris Enterprises. Few employees gave him more than a passing glance, but the anonymity served his purpose well. With his mop bucket as a cover, he was free to observe the interactions and dynamics that played out daily. What he discovered was both revealing and troubling. On the 23rd floor, home to the company's HR department, Joe had just finished tidying the break room when he overheard a heated discussion coming from a nearby meeting room. The door was slightly ajar, and voices spilled into the hallway. "I don't care if the janitorial staff complains," snapped a man's voice, sharp and impatient. Joe recognized it instantly. It was Greg Stanton, the director of employee relations. "Their hours are getting slashed, end of story. If they don't like it, they're free to look elsewhere." Another voice, softer but laced with hesitation, spoke up. "But Greg, we're already understaffed. Cutting more hours could lead to bigger issues. Overflowing trash bins, dirty offices. It'll affect morale." Greg scoffed. "Morale? For janitors? Let's not kid ourselves. They're lucky to have jobs at all. If we need to hire cheaper replacements, so be it. Now, are we done here? I've got more important things to handle." Joe froze, gripping his mop handle tightly. He'd always trusted Greg to uphold the company's values, but hearing this callous attitude toward the staff shook him to his core. He quickly scribbled Greg's name into the small notebook he kept in his pocket. His growing list of individuals who embodied the toxic culture he'd been blind to. That afternoon, Joe was assigned to clean the executive conference room after a departmental meeting. As he worked, he spotted a stack of documents left carelessly on the table. Curiosity tugged at him, and he glanced around to make sure the room was empty. Picking up the papers, his stomach sank. It was a proposed cost-cutting strategy. The report detailed reductions in employee benefits, including a drastic cut to the company's healthcare contributions for lower-wage workers. One line stood out in bold: savings, $2.5 million annually by reducing healthcare subsidies for non-essential staff, e.g. janitorial, administrative. Joe's jaw tightened. For a company that prided itself on being people first, this was a direct betrayal of its founding principles. He folded the document and slipped it into his pocket, knowing it would serve as evidence when the time came to confront the leadership. As the day wore on, Joe encountered more examples of the hierarchy's cruelty. While cleaning a restroom, he overheard two senior managers mocking an older janitor named Enrique, a quiet man who worked the night shift. "Did you see that guy? Looks like he's been here since the building was built," one of them joked. The other snorted. "Bet he doesn't even know how to use half the equipment. We should just replace him with someone younger, cheaper and faster." Joe clenched his fists, but kept his face impassive as the managers exited without acknowledging him. Later, he made a point to introduce himself to Enrique, who was mopping the hallway near the elevators. "Hey, I'm Joe," he said, extending a hand. Enrique looked surprised but smiled warmly. "Nice to meet you, Joe. You're new here, right?" "Yeah, just started this week," Joe replied. "How long have you been working here?" 22 years, Enrique said, pride evident in his voice. "It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I've seen a lot of people come and go, but I've stuck it out. Got to put my 2 kids through college, you know?" Joe nodded, his respect for Enrique growing. Here was a man who had given so much to the company, only to be disrespected by people who didn't understand the value of his contribution. As Joe continued his rounds, he began to notice a pattern. Those at the top of the hierarchy often displayed the least empathy, while those like Lisa and Enrique, the ones closer to the ground, embodied the values the company claimed to stand for. By the end of the week, Joe's notebook was filled with observations, names of toxic employees, details of overheard conversations, and notes on the systemic problems he'd witnessed. But alongside the negatives, he also documented the positives, the rare acts of kindness, and the hardworking individuals who treated everyone with respect. One such moment occurred late on Friday afternoon. Joe was tidying up the break room when Lisa walked in, holding a stack of folders. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Hey Joe, how's it going?" she asked cheerfully. "Not bad," Joe replied, appreciating her genuine friendliness. Lisa set down her folders and opened the snack cabinet. I've been meaning to say, thank you for keeping this place running. It can't be easy, especially with how busy it gets around here." Joe blinked, taken aback. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged his work all week. "Thanks, Lisa. That means a lot." She shrugged. "It's just the truth. I think people forget how important every role is. Where would we be without people like you keeping things clean?" Joe smiled, her words reigniting a flicker of hope in him. Maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. As Joe clocked out for the day, he walked past the glowing Harris Enterprises sign in the lobby. The building might have been impressive, but he now knew that its foundations were deeply flawed. Still, there was potential to rebuild, to nurture the good, and to root out the bad. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to make a change. The weekend passed slowly for Joe Harris, his mind spinning with everything he had witnessed. By Monday morning, he felt both dread and determination as he returned to Harris Enterprises. Today, he resolved to dig deeper into the lives of those who truly represented the heart of the company. His thoughts kept returning to Lisa, whose kindness stood out in sharp contrast to the dismissiveness he had seen from others. It didn't take long for their paths to cross again. Joe was cleaning the break room when Lisa walked in, balancing a cup of coffee and a tablet. She offered him her signature warm smile. "Morning, Joe. How was your weekend?" she asked, setting her things on the counter. "Quiet," Joe replied, keeping his tone casual. "How about you?" She sighed, running a hand through her auburn hair. "Busy. My mom had a rough couple of days, so I spent most of the weekend helping her out." Joe paused in his work. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is she okay?" Lisa nodded, her smile tinged with weariness. "She's managing. She's been dealing with some health issues for a while now. It's why I took this internship, actually. Needed a flexible schedule, so I could help out at home." Joe leaned on his mop handle, intrigued. "That can't be easy, balancing all that." "It's not," Lisa admitted. "But it's worth it. She's the reason I'm here, I want to build a career in marketing, get a good job, and make sure she doesn't have to worry about anything ever again." Her words struck a chord with Joe. He had always prided himself on providing opportunities for hardworking individuals. But Lisa's story was a stark reminder of the human realities behind those opportunities. He saw not just an intern, but a young woman carrying the weight of her family on her shoulders. "You're doing a good thing," Joe said sincerely. "Your mom must be proud." Lisa's face lit up with a genuine smile. "Thanks, Joe. That means a lot." For the next few days, Joe and Lisa's conversations became a regular occurrence. She would often stop to chat during her breaks, sharing anecdotes about her internship, her family, and her aspirations. In return, Joe would listen intently, careful to avoid giving away too much about his own identity. One afternoon, they ended up sharing a table in the cafeteria during a quiet moment. Lisa unwrapped a sandwich while Joe sipped on a cup of water. "Can I ask you something?" Lisa said suddenly, her tone curious. "Sure. What's your story? Most of the janitors here don't talk much, but you seem different." Joe chuckled softly, caught off guard by her question. "Not much to tell. Just a guy trying to make an honest living." Lisa arched an eyebrow. "Come on, Joe. There's got to be more than that. What did you do before this?" For a moment, Joe considered telling her the truth. Her openness made it tempting, but he couldn't risk compromising his experiment. Instead, he offered a half-truth. "I've had a few different jobs. Did some management work for a while, but I wanted a change." Lisa nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad it did. You're good people, Joe." Joe smiled, but her words carried a bittersweet edge. If only she knew. Their connection deepened later that week, during a chance encounter outside the office. Joe had just finished his shift, and was walking toward the subway station when he spotted Lisa struggling to carry a stack of groceries from a nearby market. "Need a hand?" he called out, jogging to her side. Lisa glanced up, surprised but grateful. "Joe, you don't have to." "Don't worry about it," he said, taking half the bags from her. "Where are you headed?" "Just a few blocks down," she replied. "Thanks. These were a lot heavier than I expected." As they walked, Lisa opened up even more about her life. She talked about her mom's battle with chronic illness, the financial strain it put on their family, and her determination to succeed despite the odds. Joe listened closely, each detail adding depth to the picture he was forming of her resilience and character. When they reached her building, Lisa turned to him, her eyes warm with gratitude. "You didn't have to do this, Joe." "Thank you. Anytime," Joe replied. "Take care of yourself, Lisa." That evening, as Joe sat in his modest apartment, he reflected on the stories he had heard from Lisa and others like her. They weren't just employees. They were people with struggles, dreams, and lives that extended far beyond the walls of Harris Enterprises. For years, he had focused on growth, profits, and innovation, trusting that his leadership team would ensure the company stayed true to its values. Now, he realized how much he had missed by remaining at the top, detached from the everyday realities of his workers. Lisa's words replayed in his mind, "You're good people, Joe." He hoped that when this experiment was over, she would still think so. It started as a normal day at Harris Enterprises, the kind Joe had come to expect during his week undercover. Employees hurried through the halls, coffee cups in hand, voices sharp with urgency. Joe pushed his mop bucket into the executive wing, preparing to clean the break room. The faint hum of the HVAC system was the only sound in the usually bustling corridor. Suddenly, the fire alarm blared, slicing through the calm with a piercing wail. Lights flashed red, and automated instructions played over the intercom. "Attention all personnel. Please evacuate the building immediately. This is not a drill." Joe's heart leapt. He left his mop where it stood and moved into the hallway. Employees poured from their offices, some looking panicked, others irritated. "What's going on?" someone shouted. No one had an answer. In the chaos, Joe's instincts kicked in. He scanned the crowd, noting a few people who seemed disoriented or unsure where to go. Others clustered together, scrolling on their phones or arguing about what might be happening. The managers who were supposed to lead in such situations were conspicuously absent. "Everyone stay calm," Joe shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Heads turned toward him, surprised. "Follow the emergency exit signs. Stick together and move quickly." Employees began to form groups, but the evacuation was far from orderly. Joe spotted Lisa near the back of the crowd, helping an older employee who appeared unsteady on her feet. He pushed through the throng to reach them. "Lisa, is she okay?" he asked, gesturing to the older woman. "She's just a little shaken," Lisa replied, her voice steady despite the alarm blaring overhead. "But the crowd's moving too fast. I don't want her to fall." Joe nodded. "Let's go. I'll stay with you." They moved carefully, shielding the woman from the jostling employees. Joe noticed other small groups struggling to evacuate, a pregnant woman clinging to a colleague's arm, an intern trying to wrangle his scattered team, and even a young man with a broken ankle hobbling awkwardly on crutches. Yet, despite the chaos, no senior staff stepped forward to provide guidance. As they descended the stairs, the situation grew more chaotic. Employees slowed, bunching together in confusion. "Why are we stopping?" someone shouted. "Keep moving." Joe pushed his way to the front of the bottleneck and found the source of the delay. A fire exit door had jammed, trapping everyone on the floor. Panic rippled through the crowd. "Everyone listen up," Joe called out, his voice firm and commanding. "Stay calm. The other stairwell is just down the hall. We'll get out that way." "Who put you in charge?" a voice snapped from the back. Joe didn't respond. He turned to Lisa. "Help get everyone organized. I'll check the other stairwell to make sure it's clear." Lisa nodded, her expression resolute. "Be careful." Joe darted down the hall, adrenaline fueling his steps. The second stairwell door opened easily, revealing an unobstructed path. He hurried back to the crowd. "This way. Follow me," he shouted. With Lisa's help, the group began moving again, filing into the second stairwell. Joe stayed at the back, ensuring no one was left behind. As they descended floor after floor, his pulse slowed slightly. The worst seemed to be over. When they reached the ground floor, employees spilled out into the lobby, where security guards directed them toward the outdoor assembly area. The cold air hit Joe like a wave as they exited the building, joining hundreds of other employees gathered on the sidewalk. Among the crowd, Joe saw Patrick Olson and a few other senior managers huddled together, visibly flustered but doing nothing to assist. Joe shook his head, his earlier frustrations reigniting. These were the people he had trusted to lead? They looked more concerned about their own discomfort than the well-being of their team. Lisa appeared beside him, the older woman still at her side. "We made it," she said, exhaling heavily. "You did great in there," Joe replied, genuinely impressed. "A lot of people owe you." Lisa shrugged, brushing off the compliment. "I just did what anyone would do." Joe knew better. Not everyone had stepped up the way she had. Her leadership and compassion stood in stark contrast to the self-serving behavior of others. As the crowd began to settle, the source of the alarm was finally revealed. A small electrical fire in the building's main server room. The flames had been contained quickly, and there was no structural damage. Employees were allowed to return to their workspaces within the hour, but the incident left a lasting impression on Joe. Back inside, he couldn't shake the images of panicked employees and absent leadership. The evacuation had exposed a glaring weakness in the company's culture, a lack of accountability at the top. Later that evening, as Joe logged his observations in his notebook, he thought about Lisa's unwavering determination and the manager's cowardice. The contrast was stark, but it gave him clarity. The time for passive observation was over. He would confront the rot at the core of Harris Enterprises, no matter the cost. The evacuation served as a turning point for Joe. What had initially been an experiment to observe his company's culture was now something more, a mission to expose and address its flaws. He could no longer ignore the disparity between the company's core values and the reality its employees lived daily. The next morning, Joe arrived early and took the service elevator to the basement, where the janitorial staff held their pre-shift briefing. Frank, the head custodian, was already barking instructions to the team. "Joe," he called, waving him over. "After you finish the lobby, head to the loading dock. There's a mess back there from last night's shipment." Joe nodded and got to work. Cleaning gave him time to think, but his thoughts kept returning to the names in his notebook. Patrick Olson, Greg Stanton, and others who had displayed blatant disregard for their employees. They represented everything wrong with the company, but they were only part of the problem. Joe was starting to see how deep the rot went. As he scrubbed the lobby floor, he overheard two employees from the finance department chatting nearby. "Did you hear about the janitorial hours being cut again?" one of them said, lowering her voice. "Yeah, and the rumor is they're trying to outsource more of the cleaning staff. Cheaper labor from a third-party contractor," the other replied. "They're saying it's to offset rising costs. But you know it's just to pad the bottom line." Joe's stomach churned. The thought of loyal workers like Frank and Enrique being discarded for the sake of profit made his blood boil. Determined to learn more, he decided to dig deeper into the management decisions affecting the staff. That afternoon, Joe made his way to the maintenance office, where Frank was reviewing schedules. "Hey Frank," he began, trying to sound casual, "I heard something about hours being cut. Is that true?" Frank looked up, his expression grim. "Yeah, it's true. Been happening for months. We're expected to cover the same amount of work with fewer hours and no overtime. They're bleeding us dry, Joe. Why not speak up?" Joe asked. Frank snorted. "To who? HR? Management? They don't care. As long as the floors are shiny and the trash is empty, we're invisible. It's been like this for years." Joe's heart sank. Frank's words confirmed what he had suspected. The system wasn't just broken, it was deliberately rigged against the most vulnerable employees. That evening, Joe stayed late to clean the executive offices. He knew it was risky, but he needed answers. As he emptied trash bins and wiped down desks, he scanned for anything that might shed light on the decision-making process. In Patrick Olson's office, he struck gold. a folder labeled Cost Optimization Plan Phase 3. Inside, Joe found detailed reports on the company's efforts to cut costs by targeting low-wage workers. The plan included further reductions in janitorial staff hours, outsourcing administrative roles, and scaling back benefits for employees earning below a certain threshold. The most damning part was a note at the bottom of one page: projected savings, $3.2 million annually. Justify with market trends narrative. Joe's hands shook as he read. This wasn't just a failure of leadership. It was exploitation, plain and simple. He slipped the documents into his bag, knowing they would be critical when the time came to confront the culprits. As he turned to leave, he spotted something else on Patrick's desk: an email chain between Patrick and Greg Stanton. The messages were casual, almost cavalier, as they discussed the recent policy changes. One line from Greg stood out: "They'll complain for a while, but they'll get over it. They always do." Joe felt a surge of anger. This was the attitude at the top: dismissive, callous, and entirely out of touch with the reality faced by the employees who kept the company running. The next day, Joe decided to confront one of the supervisors directly. He found Greg Stanton in the cafeteria, sitting alone with a tablet. Joe approached cautiously, his mop and bucket in tow. "Excuse me, sir," Joe said, keeping his tone polite. Greg glanced up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "What is it?" "I just wanted to ask about the recent changes to the cleaning staff's hours," Joe said. "It's been tough for some of us to keep up with the workload." Greg rolled his eyes. "Look, I don't make the policies. I just enforce them. If you have a problem, take it up with HR." Joe pressed on, his voice steady. "But don't you think these cuts hurt the people who can least afford it?" Greg's expression hardened. "You're a janitor. Your job is to clean, not to question company policy. Stick to what you're paid to do." Joe bit back his retort, knowing it wasn't the right time to reveal his true identity. Instead, he gave a curt nod and walked away, seething inside. This interaction only strengthened his resolve to take action. That evening, Joe sat in his small apartment, his notebook open on the table. The list of names had grown, each one representing a piece of the toxic culture that had taken root in Harris Enterprises. He flipped through the stolen documents and emails, his mind racing with plans. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how bitter it was. His company, the empire he had built, had lost its soul. But Joe wasn't ready to give up. The damage could be undone if he had the courage to act. With renewed determination, Joe closed the notebook and prepared for what would come next. Joe Harris spent the weekend preparing for the most pivotal moment of his experiment. The notebook filled with observations, the documents detailing exploitative policies, and the emails dripping with condescension. They all painted a damning picture of the culture at Harris Enterprises. But it wasn't enough to simply expose the truth. Joe needed to make a statement that would resonate, one that would spark real, lasting change. By Monday morning, he was ready. The company's weekly all-hands meeting was a grand affair, held in the gleaming auditorium on the top floor of Harris Enterprises. It brought together employees from every department to hear updates from senior management. The CEO, typically John Harris himself, was the main event, delivering polished speeches about the company's vision and successes. This time, though, the speech would be different. Joe arrived early, slipping into the building through the service entrance. He was still in his janitor's uniform, a conscious choice. The disguise that had allowed him to observe unnoticed would now serve as a powerful symbol. As employees filed into the auditorium, chatting and settling into their seats, Joe waited in the wings, heart pounding. Emily Parsons, his chief of staff, and one of the few people aware of his experiment, stood beside him. "Are you sure about this, John?" Emily whispered, her voice laced with both concern and admiration. "I have to do this," Joe replied. "They need to see the truth." Emily nodded and stepped onto the stage to address the audience. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her calm voice silencing the room. "Today's meeting will begin with a special announcement from our CEO, John Harris." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as employees looked around, expecting to see the impeccably dressed figure they knew so well. Instead, Joe Harris walked onto the stage, mop in hand, still wearing the tattered uniform of a janitor. The room fell silent, stunned. "Good morning," Joe began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "I'm sure most of you don't recognize me. For the past 2 weeks, I've been working here as Joe, a temporary janitor." A wave of confusion swept through the crowd. People exchanged bewildered looks, whispering to each other. In the front row, Patrick Olson and Greg Stanton sat frozen, their expressions shifting from surprise to unease. "I started this experiment because I wanted to understand the culture of this company from the ground level," Joe continued. "I wanted to see how we treat people who are often overlooked, the ones who clean our floors, stock our supplies, and keep this building running." Joe paused, scanning the room. "What I saw shocked me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook, holding it up for the audience to see. "This notebook contains everything I witnessed. The disrespect, the indifference, and the toxic behavior that has no place in any company, especially not one that claims to value its people." The room was dead silent. Even the air felt charged with tension. "I also found this," Joe said, unfolding the stolen documents and holding them up. "These are plans to cut hours, benefits, and jobs for the most vulnerable employees in this company, all while increasing executive bonuses. Is this what Harris Enterprises stands for?" A ripple of murmurs began to spread, growing louder as Joe's words sank in. "In this very room, I've seen people like Lisa," Joe said, gesturing toward the back of the auditorium where Lisa sat, her face a mixture of shock and pride. "She's an intern who works harder than most of us, and still finds time to care for her sick mother. And Enrique, who's spent over 2 decades here, only to be mocked behind his back by the same managers who should be thanking him." Joe's voice grew firmer. "This stops now. The exploitation, the disrespect, it all ends today." Patrick Olson suddenly stood, his face flushed. "Mr. Harris, with all due respect, these policies were implemented for the financial health of the company. We have to stay competitive." Joe fixed Patrick with a steely gaze. "You think this is competition? Sacrificing the dignity of our employees to save a few dollars? That's not leadership. That's cowardice." Patrick sat down, his face pale. Joe turned back to the crowd. "Effective immediately, there will be changes. Those responsible for fostering this toxic culture will be held accountable." He looked directly at Patrick and Greg. "This includes you," Greg stammered. "But..." "No excuses," Joe interrupted. "You're both dismissed. Security will escort you out." The room erupted into murmurs again, this time tinged with approval. Joe raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "To everyone else," he continued, "I promise that this company will live up to its values. We will rebuild our culture from the ground up, starting with new policies to ensure fairness, respect, and opportunity for every employee. No more empty slogans. Real change." The audience broke into applause, tentative at first, then swelling into a standing ovation. Joe felt a rush of emotion as he stepped back from the podium, his heart full but his mind already racing with the work that lay ahead. After the meeting, Joe sat in his office, now out of disguise, reviewing the new initiatives Emily had helped him draft. Lisa's name was at the top of a list of promotions, alongside others who had demonstrated leadership and integrity. When Lisa was called to the office later that afternoon, her eyes widened at the sight of Joe, this time as himself. "Joe?" she asked, incredulous. "John, actually," he said with a smile. "John Harris, CEO. And I owe you a thank you." Lisa blinked, struggling to process what was happening. "You're the CEO?" "Yes," Joe replied. "And because of people like you, this company has a future." The aftermath of the Great Revelation sent ripples throughout Harris Enterprises. News of the undercover CEO spread quickly, sparking equal parts disbelief and admiration among employees. While the meeting had marked a decisive turning point, the work of rebuilding the company's culture was only just beginning. John Harris sat at the head of the long conference table in the executive boardroom, surrounded by his leadership team. Gone were Patrick Olson and Greg Stanton, replaced by interim leaders chosen for their integrity and collaborative spirit. On the agenda for the day, enacting transformative changes. "Let's start with transparency," John began, addressing the group. "For too long, critical decisions have been made behind closed doors, with little regard for how they affect our employees. That ends now. Effective immediately, We'll hold monthly town halls where employees can voice concerns directly to leadership. A wave of nods passed around the room, but John wasn't finished. We're also implementing a third-party audit of our HR practices to ensure fair treatment for everyone, especially those in entry-level and support roles. These employees form the backbone of Harris Enterprises, and they deserve respect. Emily Parsons, his chief of staff, leaned forward. I've already contacted several firms to handle the audit. We'll make the final selection by the end of the week. Good, John said. Next, let's talk about compensation. We'll reverse the cuts to janitorial hours and reinstate the healthcare benefits that were taken away. It's not just the right thing to do. It's essential to retaining talent. At this, Frank, the head janitor, who had been invited to the meeting as part of the new inclusivity initiative, cleared his throat. Mr. Harris, I appreciate the gesture, but more than hours and benefits, what we really need is to be treated like we matter. John nodded solemnly. You're right, Frank. Respect can't be legislated. It has to be earned. That's why we're introducing empathy training for all managers. They need to understand the value of every role in this company. Later that day, John invited Lisa to his office for a private meeting. She entered hesitantly, still adjusting to the fact that Joe was the CEO she had admired from afar. Please have a seat, John said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Lisa sat, her expression a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. You wanted to see me, Mr. Harris? Call me John, he replied with a smile. And yes, I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done. Your kindness and leadership stood out during my time undercover. You reminded me of what this company should stand for. Lisa blushed. I was just being myself. And that's exactly why I want to offer you a full-time position, John said, sliding a folder across the desk. Head of Ethical Practices. Your job would be to ensure that Harris Enterprises stays true to its values. Not just on paper, but in practice. Lisa's eyes widened as she opened the folder and skimmed the offer. I don't know what to say. Say yes, John said, his tone warm but firm. We need people like you to help lead the change. Lisa hesitated for only a moment before smiling. Yes, I'd be honored. Over the next few weeks, Harris Enterprises underwent a transformation. Lisa's new department conducted interviews with employees across all levels, collecting honest feedback about the company's strengths and weaknesses. Emily spearheaded the restructuring of HR policies to prioritize fairness and inclusivity, while John made it a point to personally engage with employees during their day-to-day routines. Frank and Enrique, the veteran janitor, were asked to join a new advisory committee focused on workplace improvements. They sat side by side with senior executives, ensuring that every decision reflected the perspectives of those on the front lines. As changes took hold, the atmosphere at Harris Enterprises began to shift. Employees who had once felt invisible now saw their contributions recognized and valued. Morale improved and productivity followed. Even the building itself seemed to come alive with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as John walked through the office, he passed the break room and saw a group of employees gathered around Lisa, who was leading a discussion about upcoming initiatives. Her confidence and passion were evident, and John couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Looks like she's settling in, Emily said, appearing at his side. She's exactly where she belongs, John replied. And so are we. For the first time in years, John felt like Harris Enterprises was truly living up to the vision he had when he founded the company. But he knew the work wasn't done. Transformation wasn't a one-time effort. It was a continuous process, one that required vigilance, humility, and the willingness to listen. And as John watched his employees laugh and collaborate, he realized that this transformation wasn't just about the company. It was about him too. He had learned the true meaning of leadership, not from books or seminars, but from the people who had been there all along. The energy in Harris Enterprises had shifted dramatically in the days following Joe Harris's revelation. For the first time in years, employees felt hope ripple through the hallways. Changes were on the horizon, and they weren't just surface-level adjustments. The CEO's bold actions during the all-hands meeting had proven that his commitment to transformation was genuine. Joe sat in his office, flanked by Emily Parsons, and a handful of trusted advisors. On the table before them was a detailed plan for overhauling the company's structure, policies, and culture. "Let's go over this one more time," Joe said, running a hand through his hair. "I want every employee, from the janitors to the department heads, to feel seen and valued." Emily nodded, flipping through a stack of papers. "First, we're implementing a livable wage increase for all staff, particularly those in janitorial, administrative, and support roles. It'll come with restored benefits, including healthcare." "Good," Joe said firmly. "Make it retroactive to cover the weeks they've been underpaid." "We'll also need to revise the leadership training program," Emily added. "The new curriculum will include empathy workshops and ethics training. No one gets promoted to management without completing it." Joe nodded. "We need leaders who inspire, not intimidate." Another advisor, a seasoned HR executive, chimed in. "About the promotions, Lisa's been shortlisted for the new Ethics and Employee Experience division you wanted to establish. She'd be heading it up." A smile spread across Joe's face. "She's perfect for the role. Make it happen." As the meeting continued, they finalized plans to dismantle toxic systems and replace them with policies that prioritize fairness and inclusivity. From creating an anonymous feedback platform for employees to mandating regular audits of workplace culture, every decision aimed to rebuild trust and accountability. Later that afternoon, Joe personally delivered the news of her promotion to Lisa. He found her in the cafeteria, poring over a stack of marketing materials. When she saw him approaching, her expression flickered between shock and nervousness. "Mr. Harris," she began, standing quickly. Joe. Sir." "Relax, Lisa," Joe said with a laugh, gesturing for her to sit. "It's still just Joe." She sank back into her seat, her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry, I'm just still trying to process everything." Joe pulled up a chair and looked her in the eye. "Lisa, your kindness and leadership during the past few weeks didn't go unnoticed. You represent exactly what this company needs. That's why I'd like you to lead our new Ethics and Employee Experience division." Lisa's eyes widened. "Me? Are you serious?" "Completely," Joe said. "Your job will be to ensure that every employee, no matter their position, feels valued and supported. You'll have the resources, the authority, and my full backing." For a moment, Lisa was speechless. Then a smile broke across her face. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you. You earned it," Joe replied. "Now let's make this company better together." In the weeks that followed, the changes Joe had promised began to take shape. The toxic managers were replaced with empathetic leaders. Employees like Enrique received well-deserved raises and recognition for their years of service. Workspaces were redesigned to foster collaboration and inclusivity, and the company's mission statement was updated to reflect its renewed commitment to people-first values. Perhaps the most visible change was the announcement of the Harris Empathy Initiative, a program designed to support employees' personal and professional growth. It included scholarships for continuing education, wellness programs, and emergency funds for employees in crisis. Joe also made a public commitment to donate a portion of his annual bonus to fund these initiatives, setting an example for the rest of the leadership team. One day, as Joe walked through the newly vibrant office, he stopped by the break room. Lisa was there, chatting with Enrique and a few other employees over coffee. They laughed, the air warm with camaraderie. "Hey Joe," Lisa called out, waving him over. "Want to join us?" Joe smiled. "Don't mind if I do." As he sat among his employees, not as their distant CEO, but as one of them, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The company he had envisioned years ago was finally coming to life. Months had passed since Joe Harris revealed his undercover journey to Harris Enterprises. The transformation was undeniable. What was once a company teetering on the brink of a toxic collapse had become a thriving workplace where employees felt empowered, valued, and heard. The changes weren't just internal. The business world had taken notice too. Articles praising Harris Enterprises for its groundbreaking approach to corporate empathy and leadership filled the pages of industry journals. Other CEOs reached out to Joe, curious about how he'd turned the tide so quickly. But for Joe, the accolades weren't the goal. The real reward was walking through the halls and seeing the difference firsthand. On a crisp autumn morning, Harris Enterprises was abuzz with excitement. Employees from every level had gathered in the outdoor plaza for the dedication ceremony of the company's newest initiative, the Harris Care Center. The center, built on the lower floors of the building, was a state-of-the-art space designed to provide free childcare, wellness resources, and financial planning services for employees and their families. Joe stood on a small stage, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Familiar faces looked back at him. Lisa, now confidently leading her ethics and employee experience division. Enrique, whose smile was brighter than ever. And countless others who had become part of the company's renewed identity. "Good morning," Joe began, his voice carrying across the plaza. "Today isn't just about a new facility. It's about honoring the people who make this company what it is." He paused, letting his words settle. "Months ago, I had the privilege of walking in your shoes. I saw the challenges you faced, the kindness you offered, and the potential we had to be better. Today, I stand here proud, not because of what I've done, but because of what we've done together." Applause rippled through the crowd, growing louder as Joe continued. "This center is more than a building. It's a promise. A promise that Harris Enterprises will never again forget the value of its people. From the highest executive to the newest hire, every person here matters. And we will continue to prove that. Not with words, but with actions." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Joe stepped back, his heart swelling with pride. As he descended the stage, employees gathered around to thank him, share stories, and celebrate the moment. Later that afternoon, Joe sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The notebook he had carried as Joe the janitor rested on his desk, now filled with notes of hope and progress. Next to it was a framed photo of the janitorial team, a reminder of the people who had inspired him to make a change. The door opened, and Lisa stepped in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Thought you could use this," she said with a grin. Joe chuckled, accepting the cup. "You've got a good memory. Hard to forget the guy who showed up with a mop and changed everything," Lisa replied. "How are you feeling?" Joe leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Grateful," he said simply. "For this company, for the people who believed in me, and for the chance to make a difference." Lisa nodded. "Well, we're grateful for you too." As she left the office, Joe turned his chair to face the window, the skyline of New York stretching before him. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges. No journey worth taking ever was. But for the first time in years, he felt confident that Harris Enterprises was on the right path. And so was he. The story of Harris Enterprises spread far and wide, becoming a beacon of inspiration for companies around the world. It was a testament to the power of empathy, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and the belief that real leadership begins with listening. And it all started with a mop.